morning, good morning. How's everyone doing today?
Groovy now.
We've got a groovy from the front row. It's gonna be a good day. Just as Senator Putnam yesterday was talking about approaching the Capitol and kind of hearing this din, this low roar generate as he got closer and closer to the rotunda in the Senate chamber. As I'm walking here this morning, I'm going through the hallway and I'm like, oh, what's that? It smells really good. What is that? It's bacon. It's the sign that the CGMC is back. All right, so we've got a good program for you this morning. I think we had a great day yesterday, and also as I was enjoying the bacon smell on my walk over, I was reflecting on how we had a lot of great discussion and I think a lot of great learning yesterday. But it struck me that we haven't really talked much about the 2022 legislative session proper yet. But we're going to fix that this morning, kind of on the back half of the morning as we get into our legislative positions and then some discussion about what are the things that we think that we're actually going to try to do and try to advance as an organization next year at the legislature. So, to kick off our first, I want to do this before I forget because I almost forgot and there's often a little bit chaotic at the end. I want to take a moment to thank my staff who have worked so tirelessly to put this conference on. The ones that have put together the presentations, who have done all the logistics, who have picked the meals, who have helped think through and problem solve all along the way, and who have helped present and make it what it has been. So we have had Elizabeth Wafel, who is our environmental attorney, who you'll hear from later, Shane Zart, who does economic development and other stuff, who you'll hear from later, Anya, our policy analyst, slash amateur but very capable IT troubleshooter, who helps me particularly with a lot of the PowerPoints and such. And then, of course, Kelly and Julie, without whom this would just be a shambles. So please thank them. All right, so now to kick off the actual work that we're going to do this morning, we're going to spend some time this morning talking about the environmental challenges related to wastewater and some of the things that MPCA is talking about that is coming down the pike here in the next year. So many of your cities are members of MESR, the Environmental Science and Economic Review Board. You'd think after 14 years I'd have that. It's a sister organization of CGMCs that is made primarily of wastewater operators, and so these are the guys who know what ammonia is, know what needs to be done with it, know what nitrate is, all of that, and for whom we rely on quite a bit for some technical advice when we're engaging at the legislature or at the MPCA on some of these really complicated wastewater technical issues. So I had an opportunity, they had a conference 2 weeks ago in Brainerd that I attended, and even though I'm fairly aware of what's going on, I was absolutely dumbstruck by the scope and scale and complexity of the issues that our cities are going to be facing from a regulatory standpoint here in the next 2 to 3 years. And like I said, I'm fairly aware, I was absolutely dumbstruck. And so we put together this program to talk about some of those things and CGMC's response to them. And so that's the genesis, the origin of this morning's discussion. So we'll get into it. I'm going to lay out a little bit of kind of background at a very, very high level in terms of how CGMC has approached environmental issues. Many of you are aware of this because you've been very involved. But for those of you who are new, I think this will be pretty engaging. And then I'm going to turn it over to Gretel, who is going to give you more of the nitty-gritty details of some of this and what's going on. It's pretty, there's a lot there. It's pretty dense. But I think that you'll at least come away with an appreciation for the challenges that we're facing. And then I'm going to come back afterwards and talk a little bit about how we are planning on responding and what we need to do to respond. So this is Gretel's first CGMC conference. This is her first time presenting. So be kind. She'll do a great job and you'll learn a lot. All right, so CGMC and the environment. Since the 1990s, the CGMC has been involved in environmental issues. And our approach to the environment seeks to ensure that environmental regulations are, one, what we all want, effective at protecting the environment. That they're tailored to the needs of different communities, different situations, right? We can't look at one size fits all when we're talking about different sized communities, different types of water bodies, different types of environments, whether you're up on the Iron Range or down in southwestern Minnesota, that are based on the best available science, that are developed and applied according to state and federal law. The laws in terms of developing water quality standards and issuing permits are pretty complex, and sometimes the spirit of those laws gets, we'll say, pressed a little bit on the part of the MPCA from our perspective. And so we need to be there to hold them to account and make sure that when they are doing things, they're doing it according to law, because the impact on your communities from a dollar perspective and from a development perspective is significant, so we've got to get it right. Encourage creative solutions. You know, sometimes the most expensive solution is not the most effective solution or the best solution. And so we need to work with MPCA to be problem solvers versus merely regulators. And then finally, that it results in state and local and your ratepayer money being well spent. We need to somehow balance being both good stewards of the environment with being good stewards of public dollars. So it's a very, very complicated mix of considerations that we want to, that we need to put into place here. But it all is based on we want effective solutions to protecting the environment. So we've approached these things basically from two perspectives, more so than any other issue area that CGMC works on. We engage both at the legislature and at the agency level, in this case through the MPCA. And so oftentimes we'll use a legislative strategy to influence the regulations that are being pursued by the agency, or sometimes we'll use administrative actions at the agency to influence legislation. But to be effective and to make sure that we're covering all of the bases, we do need to be involved in both. So one of the things that we did a couple of years ago at the legislature is led an effort to ensure that when the MPCA lays out the scientific, that they have to lay out the scientific basis for their water quality standards. And that when they do, they need to take comments from stakeholders on that science. We ran into an issue a couple of years ago around water eutrophication, where by the time we were able to get involved, we were able to identify some scientific flaws, some flaws in the approach, some approaches on the part of MPCA that were not consistent with the best science and oftentimes how things were being done in other parts of the country. But it was too late at that point. And so we passed legislation that said on the front end of a rulemaking, when you are developing a water quality standard, you need to lay out your scientific basis in something that's called a technical support document. You need to take comments from stakeholders, and that technical support document needs to be reviewed alongside the concerns of stakeholders by independent peer reviewers outside of the MPCA to inform the discussion and what's going on. The idea there is the result will be better science on which to base the regulations, more confidence on the part of the regulated in what is happening at MPCA, standards and permit limits that are more effective in tackling pollution problems, less over-regulation and spending money for little environmental benefit, and less need for individual cities to fight this out with the MPCA when they're getting their permit limits. Do the work on the front end on the science so that we get a better result, that we have confidence in, that we don't have to spend lots of dollars and time and energy on your part and the MPCA's to try to work through when they actually come to you with a permit limit and say, okay, you need to attain this permit limit on this particular element, and it will at that point likely cost your city X amount of millions of dollars in wastewater upgrades. So we were able to pass this legislation a couple of years ago, really in anticipation of where we are at right now today. And so Gretel is going to take it from here and talk about a number of items that were confronted, but in particular, some rulemaking that the MPCA is initiating that we just found out about 2 weeks ago at this Messer conference on nitrate and ammonia water quality standards. And then I'm going to talk about what our response will need to be to that if we're going to ensure that we have effective regulation, that we have confidence in, that helps our communities grow and is based on problem solving versus regulating. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gretel.
Awesome. Goodness. All right, well, thank you so much, Bradley. And thank you so much, everyone. As Bradley said, this is my first CGMC conference, so I'm pretty excited. So I'm going to take you through a couple of, like Bradley said, they're a little dense, a couple of updates that we have and that we're seeing in the environmental world. First, we'll start with my personal favorites, which is the PFAS issue, a statewide heavy-hitting issue. And then we'll go into the impaired waters list, the nitrate and ammonia water quality standards, and then I'll Bradley with some action items, some important dates that you're going to want to keep your eyes on in the coming weeks and months. So without further ado, PFAS, this is a huge issue across the world. What I've started calling it is the for everywhere problem. We're dealing with chemicals that do not break down, and they're everywhere. So this is something that you've probably seen a lot about in the CGMC in brief, something that we've talked about in our legislative initiatives. So we've been working on it, but it's not going anywhere. We know this is a major human health problem. It's showing up in drinking water, it's showing up in fish tissue, and it has really long-term implications, not the least of which is cost and remediation. And the issue with this in particular is that this is something that has not been assessed individually on a dollar-for-dollar basis with regard to implications for cities and communities. So when we're talking about something like the infrastructure bill, handling PFAS by itself has not been assessed. And so that's something that is really important that we're going to need to focus on moving forward. But ultimately, this really boils down to two things. For communities, we need to make sure that we're developing strategies for communities to keep their people safe and to deal with pollution that we didn't cause. So a quick recap on what PFAS are. As I said, they're those forever chemicals. They're highly resilient, and they bioaccumulate, which means they move up the food chain. There's a lot of unknowns with these chemicals, and ultimately we don't know what we don't know. Long-term impacts we're starting to get an idea of, but what do testing strategies look like? What do treatment strategies look like? What do disposal strategies look like? Right now we're not entirely sure. We do know that conventional wastewater technology does not treat for this, and so that presents a host of challenges for communities because there's a lot of regulatory pressure to deal with this immediately, and we're not exactly sure the best way to do that right now, other than knowing that we can't really take it out in our communities through the wastewater process. So at the federal level, EPA about a month ago now, released their strategic roadmap, and there's a host of issues that are going to be kind of coming down the pike here. They're slated to begin early January, February of next year, and then go throughout the first term of the Biden administration, so through 2024. We're looking at monitoring and data collection, which is very important. As I said, we have a lot of unknowns with these things. There's, some other things. Testing methods, developing those, developing drinking water limits, And then on the other side, there's a really heavy regulatory push. There's talk of developing rulemaking for different kinds of liability. I don't know, folks are familiar with the Superfund law, but that's in talks right now. So from the water side, from the solid waste side, they're really doing a heavy push right now. So it's something that we'll keep an impact on, or keep an eye on for impacts. But really, what we're focusing on right now is the strategies at the state level. And so before I jump into this, I just kind of want to get a feel for how familiar folks are, I guess, with their wastewater technology, and whether or not folks know if their facilities land apply biosolids. Okay, a lot. So before I jump into this, one of the things that the MPCA is doing right now is they're conducting a biosolid study. And this is important to keep an eye on from a municipal perspective in particular, because right now a lot of facilities are set up to land apply biosolids. As we kind of saw in the room here, a lot of folks have that technology at their plants. And so as the MPCA is focused on other parameters, like nutrients, those phosphorus, nitrogen, that creates extra biosolids. So right now facilities are creating more of those. And the implications of this study, one of our concerns and one of the things we're closely monitoring is the impact that that'll ultimately have on that. And what we don't want to do is end up, 5-6 years from now, reinventing the wheel and saying, okay, we know we've set up all these facilities to land apply biosolids. Just kidding, we're not going to do that anymore. And so that's one thing that we'll be keeping everybody apprised of. But it's ongoing right now, this study, and it's just studying the impacts of land applied biosolids and PFAS. So how does it impact the soil? Does it impact crops as they grow in land applied biosolid soil? How does it impact water? So that's a big one. And so we want to make sure that people are aware of that and keeping their ear to the ground on that one. In addition, there's a couple of other things, as you can see on the screen here, that we've been working on, but that the state is pushing as well. Drinking water standards, again, probably a good thing at this point. Labeling requirements for products, things that we're generally supportive of. And then there's this monitoring program, which I know a number of CGMC members actually helped partake in and worked on. So that was released, the draft monitoring program was released, I think it was on Tuesday. And so we're going through that. It's open for public comment right now, and that'll be one of the dates that I'll throw up on the screen at the end. But again, just a couple of things that we want our members to be aware of, and make sure you're keeping an eye for with the updates that we send you. So the monitoring program is really beneficial at this point for most municipal organizations. It's focused on influent, which is good. It's focused on identifying sources, which is good. What we know right now is we know wastewater treatment plants are not sources of this, and so we want to make sure that regulations reflect that, because the onus is not on our communities to deal with this legacy problem. So we're pleased to see that. In addition, it's going to be done, at least initially, outside of the permitting process, which is a really important thing, because one of the things that we talk a lot about with our MESR members is, once something's in your permit, it's really, really difficult to get it out, if not impossible. So you have to connect the dots in a really tenuous way to kind of get things out of your permit once they're in. So having this at least initially outside that process is great. And then it's limited at this point to facilities with industrial pretreatment programs. So if your community has a lot of industry in it, your wastewater facility is going to be asked to partake in this monitoring program. So this is something, again, that we'll keep everybody updated on, but an important step, and right now it looks relatively favorable. So. All right, well, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk to you about the 2022 Impaired Waters List. So the Clean Water Act, every 2 years, it requires the MPCA to create a list of waters that don't comply with state water quality standards. And this is important for folks to pay attention to because the way the law works in this area is that it really places stringent requirements on any discharger that's upstream of an impaired water or impaired reach of a water. And so as you can kind of see from this nifty flow chart here, basically if this water doesn't meet any kind of water quality standard, it's placed on this list. Then MPCA conducts a pollution study, which is called a total maximum daily load study. And ultimately, more times than not, that results in permit limits, and that could mean infrastructure upgrades, and that's something we're really seeing a lot of right now. So just quick by the numbers, as you can see, I won't read through them, but the 2022 list adds 305 water bodies with 417 new impairments. So that means that multiple water bodies are impaired for more than one pollutant. And you can see the total list at the bottom there. This is something that we want our cities to make sure you're talking to your wastewater folks on this and your regulatory consultants to make sure that if there is an impairment that impacts your city, that you're aware of it and that you're participating in this process as needed and consulting your technical folks on that. So there are a number of stakeholder meetings coming up in the next month. Again, I'll have that on the slide, but just wanted to flag that for folks. On the 2022 list, we saw something new with PFOS being added as a new parameter. This is something that the state hasn't monitored, but hasn't added as a parameter impairment on the list in the past. And so PFOS is a subset. It's it's a small group of that larger PFAS umbrella set of chemicals. And what this is a water quality standard to protect humans that consume fish. So what they do is they take fish tissue and test it for this chemical and its bioaccumulative nature as it moves through fish, through the food chain. This is something, because we've never seen it before, we're looking at it, we're assessing it, and we may submit comments on it depending on how it works, but it is a site-specific standard, so it doesn't, that's why you don't see it all the way across the state. It's really focused in East Metro, where we know that 3M legacy contamination is, and then a couple of other water bodies in greater Minnesota as well. The other thing that we're seeing on the impaired waters list this year is a big one, sulfate and wild rice, and I'll take you through a little bit of a brief history on this. The existing standard is really, really tricky. So a few years ago, the MPCA went through a rulemaking to try to update this standard, and basically it was kind of a mess. Everybody agreed that the existing standard wasn't great and that it needed to be changed, but ultimately an administrative law judge said that the new one that MPCA had come up with was not good either, and so basically MPCA withdrew the rulemaking and stepped back from it and basically said, we're not going to enforce this right now. State law then basically said the standard can't be enforced. And the Clean Water Act and federal law says you have to enforce it. So when the 2020 list came out, EPA stepped in and said, you have this law on your books, it's a water quality standard, you have to enforce it. And so MPCA is now enforcing it, but what we have is really kind of a legal nightmare on our hands, because you've got one party saying we can't, we've got one party saying you have to. So this is something that has the potential to impact a lot of communities mostly because of the impaired stretches on the Mississippi River in southeastern Minnesota. Most of the facilities across the state are upstream of that. So this will probably result in some of those pollution studies, those TMDLs, and then ultimately could translate into permit limits for facilities as well. All right, and the last big thing I'm going to talk about today is nitrogen. And Bradley touched on this a little bit earlier. We have a major rulemaking kind of coming down the road at us right now. But first, I'm going to give a little primer on why this is something we care about. So nitrogen is a nutrient. It contributes to, as you can see on the screen, hypoxia, the low oxygen content in water. And so, that's part of the reason why MPCA is moving forward with this is that, Minnesota is the headwaters for 3 of the largest watersheds on the North American continent. So because of that Laurentian divide, not only is it impacting Minnesota waters, but it's really impacting the Gulf of Mexico, Lake Winnipeg, and our surrounding states that depend on those transboundary waters for drinking water and other uses. And so this has been a long-standing issue for the CGMC. We've anticipated that this rulemaking was going to happen at some point. EPA was conducting some toxicity assessments and some studies, and MPCA was waiting to begin this rulemaking process until those were completed and in hand. So we found out about a week and a half ago that, buckle up, this is on the way. And we knew it was coming, but we didn't have much of a heads up on this. So the nitrogen parameters that are going to be a part of this rulemaking, that nitrate and ammonia, they contribute to those, hypoxic zones and algae and all sorts of, stuff we don't want in our water. But what this will look like then is a total nitrogen limit in facilities permits. And so those permit limits, again, that recurring theme of they can, end up requiring plant upgrades, process changes, and that ends up costing communities a lot of money. And the frustrating part of this is that, the focus as a part of MPCA's nutrient reduction strategy is it was really heavily focused on phosphorus first. So we saw a lot of communities upgrading to treat for phosphorus specifically. And now with this coming, we don't want folks having to go back to the drawing board, every 5-year span when we see, new water quality standards developed. And so this is something that we want to really participate in because, back to those hallmarks of CGMC and our environmental stance, as Bradley said, we need scientifically sound water quality standards. We need them to be reasonable, and we really need compliance options that are flexible for our communities. And so that is one of the things that is coming, and we're not entirely sure of specific dates yet, but that technical support document, that basis for why these rules need to be updated, is going to be released next month sometime, we're told. And then, we'll go through reviewing that. It's going to be very, very dense, very technical. They're usually a couple hundred pages, and then they have appendices that, reach from here to the moon. It's something. But we're going to be wanting to work with experts in this area to make sure that, what MPCA is bringing forward is something that, something that is good, that there are compliance options for facilities, and that there's transparency throughout this whole process, because that's incredibly important, as we have learned in the past. So, CGMC in action. We know that proactive participation and proactive action on the front end is better than waiting to the end or being forced to wait to give input at the end of a rulemaking process. This is something that we want to make sure that we're fighting collectively and working together on collectively, instead of seeing kind of a piecemeal approach with cities having to deal with this when they come in individual permits. And so, as Bradley said earlier, part of this overall strategy that the CGMC has implemented is by passing this peer review standard. You can see I pulled some of the words from the actual statute, but we worked on this and got this passed in anticipation, in particular, of this total nitrogen limit potential standard, the ammonia nitrate water quality standards. And so on that, I will just throw up a couple of dates that you want to, H2 now. I couldn't resist the opportunity to throw a pun. There is a handout in your folders too that has all of these in there. One thing I want to draw people's attention to are that impaired waters list and the stakeholder meetings. They're going to be held on the dates up here based on the region that you're in. And so make sure that you are consulting your wastewater folks, your environmental folks at your city, and talking to them to make sure that, if there's something that impacts you, you know about it and you're taking the appropriate steps. The PFAS monitoring program also is accepting comments through December 20th. So again, another thing that we're going to look at and likely submit comments on. As of now, that's what we're planning. And it's same, of course, with the rulemaking. But wanted to draw people's attention to this and make sure that you're talking with your consultants, talking with your environmental staff, and participating as necessary. Last, just a couple of things that are interesting and might be helpful. MPCA is supplying money for climate resilience grants right now, particularly in stormwater, wastewater, and overall community resilience. So if that's something that your community is interested in, by all means, submit an application. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is water quality trading is one of those compliance options that we have found are particularly beneficial because you can partner with other folks in your region. Usually it's an ag-urban partnership. But it's a really effective and really affordable way to keep our waters clean, and it doesn't result in reinventing the wheel and upgrading our facilities every time a new limit is put in. So there are on the handout there are links to that. I encourage everyone to check it out, and if it's something you think is beneficial, absolutely participate. And on that note, I think that's, with the wrong direction, I think that's all I've got for you. But I'll stick around if anybody has questions or wants to chat. I obviously love talking water quality, so happy to chat with folks, and I'll pass it back over to, do you want to do questions now, or?
Let's do questions in just a minute.
Okay, I'm going to pass it back over to Bradley, and then happy to chat.
All right, thanks, Gretel. Yeah, we'll have a little bit of time for questions in just a little bit, a minute, but I think it's probably just cleaner if I take on the next couple of slides, and then we can talk about this sort of as a full package. So, obviously, as you just heard, there's a lot of complicated, dense, important things that are coming the direction of our communities. So I know you're all now experts on PFAS and that sort of thing, but if you took only one thing away from the discussion, it is that these things are complicated, they are important, and they are going to be confronting your community, no doubt about it, for sure, absolutely, full stop. And so I want to talk a little bit about how CGMC has, in practicality, responded to these things and worked with MPCA to ensure that we are getting it as absolutely right as we possibly can. So several years ago, the CGMC set up what we have been calling our Environmental Action Fund. And this was created to more effectively respond to legal and regulatory challenges as they arise. And the purpose of the EAF is to have ongoing funds available so that when they're needed, we can be nimble in response. Back in the olden days of the CGMC, when there was an issue that came up, or we needed to hire a technical consultant to look into water quality standards or work with communities on these things, we'd already set our CGMC budget. You had already gotten your dues and sent that in. And so we essentially had to go to community and pass the hat, right? And so we had to call up cities and we think, hey, I know you weren't planning on this, but this thing is coming down the pike. We need to, hire some outside help, or we need to commit some extra resources to, commenting on these issues at the agency level. Can you kick in $5,000? Can you kick in $2,500? Can you kick in larger community, maybe 20 grand? Not a very efficient way or a very nimble way to respond to these challenges. So we set up this fund on an ongoing basis to do this, so that when these things came up, like they just did 2 weeks ago at the MESRF conference with the nitrate and ammonia water quality rulemaking, we can be ready and we don't have to have those awkward conversations and pass the hat. So the fund is resourced every year through a carryover from the previous year and a voluntary assessment from CGMC members. So when your city got your due statement in August, you got your due statement that says here what it costs to be a member of CGMC, And because of these environmental issues and because they're so important, we would really ask that your community throw in a little bit extra for the environmental fund on a completely voluntary basis. So we have some communities that participate, some communities that don't. But the last couple of years, we've done this with the goal of raising 75 grand a year from the membership. And that we build these resources over time, they carry over so that we can be ready when these things come up. So currently, our budget for the